You ever have one of those sessions that starts out really promising and then very quickly turns into a complete dumpster fire? That was this session. Let's review it, go through some of these hands, and see if we could have salvaged any of the money that got totally set ablaze. Alright, so this session was played at 1-2 down in Orange City, Florida, and I'm not going to do much preamble for this one. Let's get right into it. We got a lot of hands to get through today. So this is literally our first hand at the table. We are under the gun +1, look down at pocket threes, limp under the gun. I decide to limp behind under the gun +1, and this is the kind of just room in general. There's not a tremendous amount of isolating or double isolating, so I suspect this is going to be a just fine limp behind. Get a complete from the small blind, check by the big, and off we go. And just for the record, this is a $200 max buy room, so we do have $200 to start the hand. Flop is 9-3-3, so flopping quads is always a really nice start to any session. Fire for $7 by under the gun, and I call. Really don't see much reason to raise. I'd like to let the blinds get involved or continue on with whatever thing they'd like to continue with. No real reason to raise the flop at this point. And on the turn, which is a king of diamonds, they check, and I decide to fire for 15, and let's talk about it real quick. So just in general, I'm totally fine with the bet and the bet size of 15 into roughly 22. If my opponent has a 9, I think they continue. If they have a draw, I think they continue. And if they have nothing, well, they're probably just going to fold anyway. They're probably not going to bluff a tremendous amount of rivers if they're not also going to fire the turn. So I think firing is totally standard here. And just to note something, in this room, there is a high hand promotion, I believe every 30 minutes on this day, and I would be involved in the last one that just ended, and my quads right now will win the high hand. And you don't need to see showdown in this room in order for that to be the case. So it's not like I have some sort of like weird incentive to check behind here and try to get to showdown. That's not true in this room. You can show your hand at any point and you're going to be just fine. So again, fire out for 15. Waiting for our opponent to make an action. They finally fold, show our quads, and ship a nice little $400 high hand bonus. Sweet. Excellent start to the session. Now, let's see if we can keep that trend continuing. A little while later, we are in the hijack. Look down at king 10 off. There's a limp in front of us. Decide to ISO to 20. You can make an argument for ISOing just to 15 here, but I thought 20 was going to do just fine. And against this stack size, there's oftentimes a lot of kind of limp call, a little inelastically, and then very predictable post-flop play, and creating the smaller SPR that's much easier is totally fine. So ended getting called by the big blind, also a shorter stack player, and the limper. Go three-way to a board of queen jack 4 with 2 spades. They both check to me, and I put it all in very happily. So just the way the math works out in this situation, we are talking about very small SPRs against both players, roughly 1.5 at the top side of the SPR spectrum. And my general rule is if it's under 2 SPR, I'm just going to be getting stacks inside with draws and decent pairs. Just what's going to be happening a very good chunk of the time. And I see this situation as being no different. We are open-ended, and I'm fine if my opponents fold a jack. I'm fine if they obviously are going to continue with that queen X because we still have tons of equity, and we're just go forward from there. Really not a spot that you want to overthink. I don't really like checking this back and then facing a shove on the turn and then having to make this really uncomfortable math decision for no reason, when I could just try to capitalize on fold equity and possibly watch people make mistakes. And just in general, a lot of people will make mistakes in this situation. They simply just fold way too much of their equity, put themselves into a small SPR pot, and then overfold in it. Very bad idea, by the way. Not something I would advise doing. So after a little bit of time passes, the big blind finally ends up putting in the call. The limper decides to fold. Big blind shows 8-7 of spades. Unfortunately, the 7 of clubs on the turn and nothing on the river means we end up paying them off with their wonderful pair of 7s. But still, we end up getting a spot that is totally good, mathematically speaking. Got them to commit money with a second best hand. Awesome. Just ended up losing our equity share. Nothing we can really do in this situation. So make the payoff, and let's move on to the next one. A little while later, we end up looking down at 10-9 of hearts. Game's playing a little short-handed at the moment, so decide to open under the gun to 6. And yes, the 3x BB open sizes do actually work decently well in this room. It doesn't guarantee every single person is going to call. We end up getting called by the player next to us, also the player on the button. And we do have a little bit of extra stack depth after winning an all-in against a shorty at some point between these two hands. So flop comes out 9-6-3 with 2 diamonds, 1 heart. So we do have the backdoor heart draw. Decide to c-bet 4-10, so roughly half pots. And I think I'm going to get action from enough second best hands, and we can definitely make some decisions from there, rather than just always taking a check call approach, which I know a lot of players will do in this spot. But I think betting is going to be totally fine. End up getting called by middle position, button folds. Turn is the jack of clubs, and our opponent decides to rip it over my $20 bets, and it's $45 more to call. So, not the most comfortable spot in the entire world, but at the same token, also not really a spot that I'm super interested in folding either. This looks like a situation where our opponent can definitely have second best draws, or just draws in general, right? They can have diamonds, they could have things like 7-8, they could possibly have something like a worse 9 that they want to commit with in this situation, because they don't really want to fold, and they don't really want to call here either, so they just rip it. You see a lot of weird stuff like this at 1-2, and I know we can definitely be running into bigger hands, but it's not that much more to call. We're getting a decent price. I mean, roughly 3-1, give or take at this moment. I think overall I'm going to be just fine with a call. We're going to find enough second best stuff in their range. It's not like a deeper stack situation or someone who I know has a really, really tight range here. I think overall this is going to be just fine as a call. So end up pondering for a quick moment, doing a little bit of mental math at this point. Flick in the call. And our opponent shows Jack 10 of spades. And unfortunately, the King of Hearts on the river does nothing for us, and they end up winning this pot. So, not the greatest result in the entire world, but again, I'm fine with it overall. I think there's enough stuff in our opponent's shoving range that we can call here decently profitably. Again, I'm not expecting this to be like the fattest call in the entire world, but at the same token, I can't really look at this spot and say I should fold. You can make an argument for checking the turn and making some decisions, but I think overall I'd much rather just fire there rather than go into a check mode, because if you check and you face a decent sized bet, do you really want to fold? Not really. Do you really want to check shove? Maybe, but again, like all of that's kind of in the commitment mindset. So I'm totally okay firing the turn, hoping to get looked up by some second best hands or shoved on by some second best hands too, and simply go forward. So not the greatest result, but what are you going to do? Let's continue on, look at the next hand. A little while later, we find ourselves on the button. 2 limpers in early position. Look down at red kings. Obviously going to be raising this, no questions. Just decided to ISO for 15. Normally this would be 220, but at this table, the way it had been playing, 15 seemed to be the preferred size on the ISOs. So decided to use that number. Get called by the big blind. The first limper, the second limper folds. I don't know what that person is possibly limp folding for, closing action, but I digress. The flop is extremely, extremely wet at king, queen, jack, all spades. But flopping top set is always a little bit of a nice consolation given the crappy texture. Decided to fire for 20. This probably could have been a little bit larger. Something like 25, 30 I think would be a bit better in this scenario, but 20 is the number that I chose. Big blind thinks for a little bit and then cuts out an $80 check raise. EP1 decides to call. I just double check that I'm in the same situation I think I'm in, and yep, still top set on a super wet monotone board. And I can't see any reason to do anything other than just shove it at this point, so let's at least talk about it for a minute. I mean, you can make the argument that our opponent can have strong hands. Yeah, of course, they can have nuttish hands, they can have ace-10, they can have spades, and, you know, what are you going to do at that point? But they could also possibly make mistakes with things like king-queen or queen-jack, and okay. Obviously, putting in more second best combos against us is always something that I'm very happy with. They could also have things like pair plus draw or just the double draw. Like they could just have the naked ace of spades and maybe they take those check raise with that. it's too difficult to narrow it in on them only exclusively having the hands that beat us. And even when they do have the hands that beat us, unless it's the royal or the straight flush, then we're in a situation where, okay, we still have a decent chunk of equity, and I just can't imagine folding it. I also don't really want to call here, let a spade come off, face a shove, and then have to make that awkward decision. And if they're going to make mistakes with like two pair on the check raise, this is a situation where, again, why let the spade roll off and possibly let them get away from it? So they seem interested right this moment. Sure, I'm going to be punting into bigger hands some chunk of the time, but at the same token, I can't find another line in this situation. If you do, by all means, please leave a comment down below. But I think at this point, we have to shove it in. We just don't have stack depth that would lead me to take a different line at this point. So we end up getting called by the big blind after not too long. He shows ace 10 with no spade. Again, not super shocked at this point. The other player finally ends up showing his hand. He has ace 9 with the ace of spades. Dealer finally gets the side pot all oriented. Turn is the 10 of clubs, river 3 of diamonds, and unfortunately no improvement for me. So they end up chopping up the main, and I lose the entire thing. So not the greatest result in the entire world, but by the same token, I can't think of anything else to do in this spot. So again, if you have any other thoughts on this hand, please don't hesitate to leave a comment and let me know what you would do in this spot if you could somehow avoid dumping off your entire stack here. A little while later, there's a raise to 5 under the gun, call by hijack. I look down at king queen off in the small, decide to call. You could certainly make an argument for attempting to squeeze this, but I think against an under the gun opener, $5 honestly is not the most uncommon open here, so it's not like $5 indicates one thing versus the other, and this opponent just I didn't have any information that they would make those kind of forking decisions pre-flop. So because of that, I think calling is fine. I can't really imagine folding. And again, squeezing in some spots, but I don't think this is the exact situation to do it. Unfortunately, the big blind does end up squeezing up to 15 total. Call by the first raiser. Call again by the caller. And I end up coming over the top here to 105 total. So this probably looks a little bit weird, but let's talk about it for a moment. So if I can be a little honest with you, I have a bit of a problem. And the problem is that if I see a bunch of money out in the middle that looks fairly uncontested, it takes me a tremendous amount of discipline not to just go after it. And in this situation, obviously I did decide to go after it. So let's talk about why. Because the big blind did squeeze, yes, so they are obviously contesting after this thing. They're trying to represent that they have a big hand, and realistically they probably do a decent chunk of the time. The early position opener decided to open and then call, and they're definitely saying they have a decently strong hand, but probably not the pure nuts, because I think a lot of players, especially at 1-2, tend to just blindly 4-bet there, so I don't think that we're looking at things like aces and kings every single time, and I do block kings anyway. In the middle position, whatever. They called once, they called twice. They probably have the kind of hand that calls twice in a situation like this. So the one that I'm most nervous about is the big blind, but they only decided to squeeze to 15. And I really think that if this is going to be a super strong squeeze in this spot, that they're probably going to choose a number something closer to 20 or 25, and I think the 15 tends to shade a little bit on the weaker side, just meaning something that they're not quite as comfortable with. So does that mean more things like ace queen or ace jack, or possibly things like jacks, 10s, and 9s, things that feel comfortable squeezing but don't necessarily 100% of the time want to put their stack in the middle? That's kind of what I'm thinking in this spot. So I'm seeing dilution from the under the gun person's range, I'm seeing some dilution from the big blind's range, and at the same time, I'm still looking at $50 out here that I want to contest for. I'll spare you running the entire complex math with all the different runs to look at some different case and fringe cases, but I think overall this is going to be okay. And obviously if we end up getting called by whatever we end up getting called by, we always have some equity, and that's always nice too. So with all of that being said, again, 105 is the number we come over the top to. Big blind thinks for a minute, puts the rest of his stack in. Under the gun takes a very long time and folds. Other person folds. I call very quickly. He ends up showing pocket jacks. Flop is 8-6-4, no bueno for us. 8 on the turn, no bueno. 10 on the river, and brick, brick, brick. So they end up getting a nice little double up through us. Still totally fine with the way it all kind of rang out pre-flop. Again, when I see that smaller squeeze size, I'm really thinking there's probably a lighter weight on the really strong stuff, the Queens Plus, and a slightly larger weight on the more marginal hands. And honestly, I've seen 1-2 players make this kind of squeeze with something like Ace Queen and then squeeze fold it. And because of that, and a lot of other hands that could be in that squeeze range, probably not getting folds from things like 10s and jacks, but I'm probably getting some other folds, and I'm totally happy with that overall. And again, worst comes to worst, I have some equity. Fortunately, didn't hit it this time, which seems to be a common theme so far. So let's move on and get on to the next hand. A while later, we are in the big blind. Limp out of the gun, limp by the cutoff. Look down at Queen 9 off. Small blind goes away. I check my option. Don't really see much reason to raise here, nor to really do anything else. So flop is Queen 5-4 rainbow. I decided to check. I lead this a lot of the time, but decided to check here based upon the way the game was playing. Face a $6 bet from under the gun. Call by the other player. I call as well. Totally, I'm definitely not folding, and really didn't see much reason at that point to check raise. Turn is the Jack of clubs. I check. They fire for 8. Call by the other player. And I decide to check raise this up to 30. So just in general, when I see this kind of like weird small bet thing on the turn from under the gun, I'm just not looking at this as being a tremendous amount of strength. I'm not 100% sure what it is, but it definitely can be some second best hands and just like weird testing the waters or trying to control the price with a draw or just something funky and weird. And the other player can definitely have a tremendous amount of draws here based upon the way they've been playing. Obviously not flush draws given the board is totally rainbow, but lots of different gut shots and straight draws and all those kind of weird things. So I really like the check raise here. I think if they do have a stronger hand, I was probably going to give roughly this amount of money away anyway. If they bet the river, am I really going to check fold very often? Probably not. It really allows me to capitalize when they do have their draws. I like that a tremendous amount. And if someone 3-bets, well, probably pretty obvious what they have at this point, and I'm not super concerned. So I think the check raise does a lot of good stuff. Obviously, we could be against some better hands, like better Queen X, King Queen, Ace Queen. It's strange, but not the most uncommon thing in the world at 1-2. So occasionally I will value in myself, but honestly, when there are a lot of draws present, these kind of check raises tend to make the river go check, check, very, very straightforward and face up, and you end up winning a decent chunk of that time, especially when your opponents are not likely to play draws very aggressively and really ever consider 3-betting them right here on the turn. So that's kind of what's going through my head at this point when I check raise up to 30. So as it rolls out, our opponent takes a little bit of time, eventually flicks in the call. Other guy ends up folding, so heads up to the river with the under the gun player. River is the 6 of clubs. I check. They check behind, table Queen 8, and we end up shipping it. Kicker ends up playing. So awesome results, but at the same token, he did open limp Queen 8 suited from under the gun. So definitely something that we want to be keeping in mind. This is the exact same player that had jacks in the previous hand, and I think we're going to tangle with them a little bit more in this session as well. A little while later, we are in the small blind. Look down at Jack 9 off. It's a limp from early position. Limp behind from the cutoff. Decide to complete. You can make an argument for folding this instead of completing, but I think I'm okay with it overall. And the flop is lovely. King, Queen, 10. So I'm flopping the bottom side of the straight. Lead out for roughly pot for 10. And just for the record, I've been enjoying using more of these rounded numbers as opposed to like trying to bet really precise and bet like $7 or $8 here. Just makes the dealer's life easier, makes the game go a little bit faster, and I've had some nice success with that. So that's why it's a little bit over pot size in general. So end up getting called by the big blind, called by early position. Cutoff thinks for a quick moment and raises it up to 30. and I decide to call. So while I certainly do like to play my made hands nice and aggressive and fast, I look at this situation and I'm like, okay, these players can definitely have full ace jack. Maybe they shouldn't, like the cutoff shouldn't be limping behind with ace jack, but a lot of players at 1-2 will, so I kind of have to keep that in mind here, that ace jack is very, very possible in all of the ranges, and also all of the sets are actually quite possible as well. Again, not that they should be, but because the high hand promotion in this room, people tend to do a lot of weird things pre-flop with their stronger hands. So keep that in mind as we go through. That can definitely tweak the ranges a little bit. But in this situation, if I 3-bet, I think I allow pretty much every single person to play really, really close to perfect, versus call here and likely invite at least one of the other two players to come along as well, and then turns and rivers should be fairly straightforward, assuming that the board doesn't get too nasty. It's not that I'm trying to find a fold anywhere along the way, it's that I'm trying to make sure that I don't allow my opponents to play totally, totally perfect. And I think, again, if we 3-bet, that's probably, unfortunately, what's going to end up happening. So after I call, the big blind thinks for a moment, flicks in his call as well, and the early position player finally decides to fold. Turn is a very nasty queen of hearts, putting up the backdoor draw and obviously pairing the board. I check, big blind checks, cutoff checks too. Don't really see much reason for me to lead the turn. But when the river is the 3 of clubs, I also don't really love checking this if someone has a single pair hand, or well, pretty much single pair that now has 2 pair. I think there's definitely some continuance that can and will happen. So I decided to fire out the river for 45. And honestly, it's a little bit of a bet fold mentality against these players and against what I assume is going to be a likely shove range. And we do end up facing the shove from the big blind. Cutoff thinks for a moment and then folds. And at this point, I'm taking a moment to think, do I want to stick with my bet fold plan? Or is it worthwhile to just stick it in here? It's really the only thing going through my head is, should I stick to my plan, or is there some reason for me to deviate from it? Yep, still the bottom side of a straight on a paired board, James. And decide to make the call, and unfortunately end up getting shown the bad news of pocket kings. So, not the greatest result in the world, and again, gonna have to be making another payoff. Did you notice that foreshadowing earlier? This is the same opponent with the jacks, and then also the previous hand. Same guy. Same guy. It's the same guy. But all kidding aside in this situation, I probably still should have stuck with my bet fold plan on the river. At 1-2, that river is just so rarely ever a bluff shove for your opponents. It's pretty much exclusively going to be very, very weird full houses. And things like full houses can make sense. He could have maybe king queen or queen 10. I'm not really expecting to see pocket kings every single time. That just kind of is a weird one. But again, in a room like this that has these kind of high hand promos, I really should have factored in a little bit more of that. And again, like, what bluff hands is he really going to end up showing up with? I don't really think he's incentivized to shove with like a naked queen, and the whole thing is just kind of gross. I should have stuck with my original bet fold plan. I really don't like the fact that I end up paying this off. And again, like, what second best stuff is he really mashing with here? I don't really think I beat anything. I'm just hoping that he finds some weird bluff in his shove range. Yeah, probably not a great call by me, but what are you going to do? Let's move on to the next one. A little while later, find ourselves in the small blind again. Raised by the hijack, call by the cutoff, call by the button, look down at queen jack suited. Decide to call here as well. And this could be a squeeze some chunk of the time, but given the stack sizes of the cutoff and button, didn't really want to do that. You can make an argument that given those stack sizes might be a little thin on the call side, which is totally fine. I can totally get on board with that. Flop, though, is lovely. 9-7-5 with 2 spades. I check. Lead by the big blind for 11. Call by the pre-flop raiser. Raise to 25 by the cutoff. Call by the button. And I decided to raise this to 115 total. All right, so a couple of things to consider here. First and foremost, yes, you can make an argument that I could lead this spot instead of just going for the check, but I thought this was going to be the kind of spot where there would be a bet by the big blind or the preflop raiser, a call or two in front of me, and then I could make this exact kind of check raise. Wasn't expecting this exact action, but it happens. But after I check, we have to keep in mind that the big blind did only fire 11 into roughly a $50 pot, which is definitely on the small side of the spectrum. Sure, he and I could definitely have a tremendous amount of the strong combos here, just given middling board and the way this is all going to run out. But I don't know. I don't think 11 into 50 is his I have a really strong hand here a lot of the time kind of bet size. And also the just call by the preflop raiser is one where I don't think he necessarily wants to play for stacks either. So given that, I pretty much am between the cutoff and the button for a decent chunk of the stack off potential, and against them I'm definitely not going to be folding overs and a flush draw, so I just decide to go for the raise. If I call here, I'm definitely inviting both the big blind and the first raiser to come along as well, and I just think that spot's going to be a little bit gross, so decide to go for the raise myself, punish it, and go forward from there. So continuing on with the hand, big blind folds, preflop raiser folds, not too shocked about either of those things. Cutoff gets it all in. And the button ends up tanking for about 2.5 minutes before finally folding. End up getting shown the bad news, pocket kings by the cutoff, and unfortunately ace 8 on the run out, no spades, and end up shipping the pot right over in that direction. So totally okay with the play itself, just would be nice to actualize my equity in this spot, but not all draws improve, this one being one of them. So let's continue on and see how the rest of this session ends up hammering out. Final hand of this session, under the gun, look down at king 10 suited, decide to open it to 6. Totally fine with this overall. Get called by the player next to act, and the player after them, and the button, and the small blind, and the big blind, so end up going a billion way to the flop, or more specifically, 6 ways to it. Flop is pretty at ace queen jack, giving us a straight, but not so great that it's all clubs. Everyone checks to me, decide to bet for 15. You can make an argument for putting this into your check call range, but I decided to go for the stab instead. Get one call by the player that has position on us, as well as by the big blind. Big blind does not have very much stack size left at this point. Turn is the queen of hearts, pairs that board up. Big blind shoves. For 25 total, I decided to flick in the call. There's certainly an argument that could be made for raising here. I thought calling would be a little bit better against middle position. So have a side pot of $0 at this point. Main pot is complete. River, unfortunately, 8 of clubs. I check. And my opponent ends up thinking for a while and then cuts out a $90 bet. So obviously the situation completely sucks. The 4th club came through and we're facing a $90 bet into a $0 side pot. So there's no real reason for me to believe that I'm going to be good here enough of the time or really anywhere close to it. Would they really bet here with like naked ace-x without a club? I don't think so. So this is probably going to be like weird boats and some king-x of club kind of hands, and I don't know exactly how those are made, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. I can't really see any way that I could call here and expect this to be profitable. So decide to hit the fold button fairly quickly. Middle position shows queen 10, no club, and the other person shows 10-9 of spades. So, unfortunately, this was my pot to be won. I don't know what the heck that person is doing with queen 10. That is like the stupidest bet in the entire world into a dry side pot. I don't know. I don't know. And I'm losing in this game. I don't know what's going on here. I have no idea. So I ended up playing about another half hour after this, and nothing exciting really happened, so ended up racking up and heading on home. It was a 5.5 hour long session, down 647, hourly rate of negative 118, not great, and BB per 100 of negative 235. And yeah, these kind of sessions happen. It's really important that we are able to work through them. And by the way, these numbers are including the plus 400 that I did get from that high hand bonus in the beginning. So really, at the end of the day, if I didn't get that, this would have been a negative $1,000 session at 1-2, which is a little brutal. But some of these spots were a little odd, to say the least. Some really strong straights that we ended up flopping that just didn't really work out for us. A lot of our draws did not end up improving. And, at the end of the day, what are you going to do? These kind of things happen. It's really important that we are able to work through sessions like this, not completely tilt and tank off, and that we review these kind of things. That's exactly what vlog episodes like this are all about. And that is going to wrap up vlog episode number 7. Not the most profitable session in the world, but hopefully you enjoyed it nonetheless. As always, if you have any comments or questions, any suggestions for future episodes, please do not hesitate to leave a comment down below, and of course a thumbs up if you enjoyed it would be massively, massively appreciated. I'll see you back shortly with a brand new episode, and of course more poker videos, and in the meantime, good luck out there, and happy grinding.